The David Pakman Show at davidpakman.com.
One of the things I've talked about on the show and that I often talk about when I speak to students, either in classes I'm teaching or where I'm lecturing elsewhere, is the idea of bias by story selection and the concept that the stories we're even aware of in a particular day, if we consume any news at all, and not everybody does, represent this tiny portion, some 0.000, I don't know how many 1% of all the stories that we could have heard about, all of the stuff that happened in a particular day on our planet. And it's really important to understand why that is. And sometimes it's because of bias to sensationalism. Sometimes it's because of advertiser bias or corporate bias or bias to availability, right? The idea that we hear from the Pentagon on most days on every cable channel, not because there's actually news from the Pentagon on every single day, but because most news channels have somebody at the Pentagon. They've got them there already. So it's way cheaper and easier to report so-called news from that location than from some other where you might not be set up. So this gets us to a terror attempt that took place last week at an airport in the United States. You might be saying, well, hold on, wait, what are you talking about? I didn't hear about that. You didn't hear about it because there was effectively no coverage of it whatsoever. There was silence on this issue from our president, Donald Trump, who usually is very quick to try to take advantage of any attempted or successful terrorist attacks to push some or other harebrained policy. And the details of the story are as follows. In Asheville, North Carolina's airport, not long after midnight on a late night last week, a man who was wearing all black walked into the terminal, was seen on security footage coming in with a bag, and then leaving without the bag. This immediately raised the suspicions of airport security. A bomb-sniffing dog was brought out, sniffed the bag, and signaled that there was something explosive within it. And indeed, ANFO, which is ammonium nitrate fuel oil, was found inside of it. That's a kind of explosive which, according to the criminal complaint, has been used in a number of terrorist-related incidents around the world. And the way that that material works is that when an ignition source comes into contact with it, it violently explodes. It's a bomb. Sometimes metal will be added to the bomb to create shrapnel and increase the physical harm that it causes, right? You could do sharp nails or bullets or other stuff. Both sharp nails and bullets were actually found in this bomb. Now, again, you're probably hearing me say this and you're thinking, David, that's major. An attempted terrorist attack with a shrapnel-laden bomb found in an American airport, and we didn't hear about it. Well, the alarm on the bomb was scheduled to go off at 6 a.m., meaning that this was found a few hours before it actually exploded. The man in question was found. He openly admitted to authorities that he was preparing to, quote, fight a war on U.S. soil, a bomb against whom and on whose behalf we don't actually know. So why didn't we hear about it? Now, it's very easy to say, well, David, we didn't hear about it because it was foiled. Wrong. We hear about foiled attacks all the time, but it depends on the particulars of the attack and of the would-be perpetrator. This was just another American white guy. What if this foiled attack with a shrapnel-laden bomb at an American airport had been Muslim? That would then have been reported and used as justification for the travel ban by the President of the United States. What if this would-be perpetrator had been Hispanic? Well, then it would have been justification for the wall with Mexico, because some, I'm sure, are good people, but they're not exactly sending us our best. But it was just your average American white guy. Who was his war even against? I don't know, but he was one of these white militia types that we've been hearing more and more about from groups that track extremists like the Anti-Defamation League. So the fundamental point to be made here is that if you make a big deal out of this foiled terrorist attack by just an American white guy, it doesn't advance any political agenda. Our safety agenda would benefit from us realizing that it's mostly white Americans who commit terror in the United States. The safety agenda would be advanced by realizing that. The political agenda of the American right is advanced only when there's a pretext, right? Muslims, Hispanics, whatever, if the incident, foiled or successful, can provide a pretext for legislation that the right wants to pass, that's when we hear about it. And it's very popular to frame the threat as an external one that we can insulate ourselves against if we keep the right people out of the country. But once again, it's not. And again, you didn't hear about this because it did not serve the current administration's political agenda. There's a funny and scary article from Eric Levitz in New York Magazine, and he's pointing out something that we've been reporting on piecemeal for several months, which is that Donald Trump seems to become enraged when there is accurate reporting about the impact of the legislation he wants passed. So forget about low information voters who are falling for this stuff. We have maybe our lowest ever information president. And the main point is Donald Trump doesn't know what his policies are going to do or what his proposals are going to do. He signs off on stuff, maybe because someone 5 minutes prior told him it was going to be a good idea. Later, he starts seeing reporting about what the impact of his policies would be, and he ends up furious, usually with someone, I guess whoever suggested to him these ideas in the first place. So I'll give you some examples, right? The Obamacare repeal promise that he and many other Republicans made during the campaign, that turned into the Republicans have proposed a mean bill. Well, yeah, and Donald Trump ended up furious with the accurate coverage of what would happen to people's health care if Trump Care, I believe at the time 1.0, was enacted and Obamacare repealed. Trump campaigned on, I'm going to have a tax plan that's going to be really, really great for the middle class. He publishes the tax plan, and then the analyses accurately say, hold on a second, this is a major giveaway for the richest of all Americans. This is really going to do nothing for the middle class. It'll be great for people with gigantic estates. Accurate coverage, Trump furious about how the coverage is going because he's just learning what the impact of his policy is going to be. Another example from the tax proposal, Trump was fully on board with this idea of repealing the deductibility of state and local taxes at the federal level. Everybody who has some economic sense flips out and tells Trump, you know, that's terrible for the middle class. And now Trump is furious and he has come out against the elimination of that tax deductibility for the state and local tax. And an important discussion that we have to have when we talk about this is it's very easy, and I know I've talked about, is Trump suffering from the early stages of dementia? Does Trump have Alzheimer's? Does Trump have limited cognition or limited ability to read? It becomes sort of an easy out in a way because it excuses Donald Trump being genuinely clueless and in over his head. And it excuses those who voted for Donald Trump, right? Because if we just write off the total lack of connection to the real world impact of Donald Trump's policies, if we say it's not because he's a genuinely selfish and bad guy, it's not because he's in way over his head, if we say it's dementia or Alzheimer's, we're excusing those who voted for Donald Trump, and we shouldn't be doing that. They don't deserve to be excused for having put this guy in the Oval Office. And I don't know the reality of the possible diagnoses of Donald Trump, whether it is limited literacy or Alzheimer's or dementia or whatever the case may be. But the problem here is under the understanding that Donald Trump is not currently senile, he is clueless on policy and appears to genuinely not be a good person. There's a conversation I saw from an interview recently that Donald Trump did with Forbes' Randall Lane. And it's an example of this total lack of understanding that doesn't seem to be dementia or Alzheimer's. And the conversation that they had is one where Randall Lane said about Donald Trump's tax plan, so it's a massive tax cut, but then that runs against your pledge to not increase the deficit because you can't, you know? And Trump says, no, because a tax cut will spur growth. And Lane says, yes, that is true, and there is dynamic scoring. And Trump adds, the growth the growth will be so much that it'll be, and Lane interrupts and says, yeah, but history has shown that you can't just cut. It does spur growth, but it won't pay for itself. History has shown that. And Donald Trump says, well, history has also shown the opposite. I mean, you've had it both ways. It has shown both ways. So Donald Trump then tries to come up with an example of when tax cuts have been economically stimulative above and beyond the decreased revenue. And he says, well, during Reagan, tremendous growth. And Lane accurately points out there was growth, but it ballooned the deficit. I want to think through an example here, because if you just put in 2 minutes of time into thinking about this idea, if you cut taxes for the rich, does it really spur enough growth to make up for the lost government revenue? Imagine an economy that is $10,000, okay? The total economy is $10,000. You want to cut the tax rate, let's say, from 40% to 30%, okay? So at a 40% tax rate in your $10,000 economy, that's $4,000 in tax revenue. If you cut the tax rate to 30%, you now have $3,000 in tax revenue. So your play is you'll cut the taxes, you'll lose $1,000 in tax revenue, but the economy will grow so much that you'll add more than $1,000 in tax revenue in the end. In order for that to happen with a 30% tax rate, to recover $1,000 in tax revenue, you need your economy to grow $3,300. So the break even is that the economic multiplier on the cut money needs to be 3.33. If you give that $1,000 in tax cuts to the rich, it is mostly going to be saved because they don't need that money, and they are not going to put it back into the economy in a way that will have an economic multiplier of 3.33. It just won't work. If you give $1,000 to the rich, you're not going to grow your economy by $3,300. And the problem is that it's not just Trump who supports and believes this stuff. Lots of voters support and believe this stuff. They've all been bamboozled, and no one knows any better than the president. So I think that this is a very, very good piece that you should check out, and we're linking to it on YouTube, because it points out that Donald Trump genuinely is furious when he finds out what his policies will do, because he doesn't understand what they will do. There is one area where I disagree with this piece, which is that it seems to take the position that Trump has good intentions and he's just kind of an easily manipulated moron. I've been very clear. It's clear to me that Trump has a policy. His personal philosophy, his political philosophy, is one of self-aggrandizement and self-enrichment and greed, period. So while I think the piece is very well written and it points out Trump genuinely does become surprised when he reads about the impact of his policies, I don't think the guy has great intentions. I think his only goal is self-enrichment, self-aggrandizement, and patting himself on the back. And we've been seeing that in terms of this horrible hurricane recovery. So check out the article, think about this example, and let me know where I'm going wrong if I am. I'm on Twitter at @dpakman. The show is on Twitter at David Pakman Show.
The David Pakman Show at davidpakman.com. The David Pakman Show at davidpakman.com.
Today's new member of the day is Trip Affleck. Trip, thank you so much for being a David Pakman Show member. This is viewer and listener supported media. We've had some ups and downs on the show when it comes to funding over the last 6 months or so, but we've had a lot of new people that were previously not supporting the program financially enter the world of supporting independent media. And I couldn't thank you more, including Trip Affleck. You can sign up for membership at davidpakman.com/membership. You can make a contribution of as little as $1 a month at patreon.com/davidpakmanshow. And if you ever shop on amazon.com, please visit davidpakman.com/Amazon before you shop, because that will send us a kickback for everything you buy. Let's talk about a sort of, I guess it's a First Amendment story, but it's kind of a Second Amendment story. To set it up, for years, I've been pointing out that so many times you have what I call First Amendment confusion. You have people, typically on the right, alleging that someone's First Amendment rights are being violated, or alleging that someone's free speech rights are being infringed upon, when really they're not, or even using the word censorship when you're not talking about censorship. First Amendment arguments depend directly upon the government infringing or intervening in someone's ability to speak. And when we talk about free speech more broadly, a common misunderstanding is that free speech means there can be no consequences to one exercising their freedom of speech. And of course, freedom of speech is not freedom from the consequences of that speech. We have a sort of, I don't know if I want to call it a boy who cried wolf scenario, but we have a situation that, if taken at face value, would suggest some real, actual First Amendment concerns. There's an Indiana Republican congressman named Jim Lucas who has drafted but not submitted a bill, and that's key here. He has not filed this bill. And it's a bill that would require professional journalists to be licensed by state police. They would have to submit an application to the Indiana State Police. Journalists would get fingerprinted as part of the process. They would pay a licensing fee of $75. I guess that gets you a lifetime license to be a journalist. And those with felony or domestic battery convictions would be prohibited from getting a journalism license. Now, you might be hearing me say this and you're saying, wait a second. What constitutes being a professional versus amateur journalist? Or what's a journalist versus a reporter versus a commentator or analyst or blogger? Doesn't matter, because this is not an honest bill. This is a bill that Jim Lucas has drafted to try to make some great point about the Second Amendment. Basically, what Jim Lucas is trying to say is, if you're going to require licenses merely for exercising one's Second Amendment right to own firearms, then what about requiring licensing to take advantage of the First Amendment as well? So it's rhetorical. I get it. Jim Lucas is trying to make a point. But is this a good point? In order to figure out whether this point makes sense, we have to think about whether licensing for the Second Amendment would in any way be analogous to licensing in order to use the First Amendment. Hint, it's not a good analogy. The First Amendment specifically says, Congress shall make no law restricting the freedom of the press as well as other forms of speech. The Second Amendment says people can have guns. It doesn't say you can't require licenses. It doesn't mean you can have any gun, because if the argument is from someone like Jim Lucas that the Second Amendment is absolute, and that would be implied by this analogy to licensing journalists, if you believe the Second Amendment is absolute, then you have no reason to defend not allowing the average person to have an automatic machine gun or a shoulder-mounted small missile launcher or RPG. As soon as you say, no, the Second Amendment is not absolute in the sense that we should have some regulation as to what weapons or firearms the individual citizen should have access to. As soon as you do that, then you are going into a gray area. And again, the First Amendment says Congress shall make no law. The Second Amendment doesn't say that. The Second Amendment doesn't prohibit any law abridging the freedom of gun ownership. It just says there is a right to own guns. Gun licensing doesn't infringe upon someone's right to own a gun. Even Antonin Scalia believed that laws requiring licensing for guns were constitutional. The only part that does prevent people from owning guns that would infringe upon the Second Amendment is the part of the law that says that felons can't have guns. But that's not the part that Jim Lucas is taking issue with. It's the licensing part. It's a rhetorical bill that is absolutely ludicrous by making this bogus analogy between the Second Amendment and the First Amendment, but people are falling for it. There are people in Indiana, I've been reading on the Indiana subreddit and Indiana news websites. People love this. People think that Jim Lucas is making some amazing political point here. He's not. Only someone who totally misunderstands the First Amendment and the Second Amendment could think that. I've been talking for a while about a way that elected officials, really Republicans and Trump, could damage the Affordable Care Act without repealing the Affordable Care Act. And that is by sabotaging it, or sabotaging it, to quote William Shatner, without actually repealing it, merely by defunding it, okay? Donald Trump has now taken some steps to do exactly this just before this recent weekend. Donald Trump has decided he's going to get rid of the subsidies to health insurers for low-income people to help them pay for health insurance, right? This will be one of those situations that will not change the law, but it will change the ability for the government to help people pay for insurance. Donald Trump is also going to allow for even cheaper policies that will have very few benefits and few customer protections. Another way that you are going to damage the end consumer of health insurance. And this is so funny, actually. There's this guy in the video, if you're watching, guy with the mustache and the glasses over Trump's right shoulder. I know that guy. That's Dave Ratner. He's the owner of this retail chain called Dave's Soda and Pet City out in Western Massachusetts. When I worked at Circuit City, I sold that guy some computers. He was not known as a right winger in Western Massachusetts, and he showed up behind Trump when Trump was signing some of this nonsense. And he is getting crushed because Western Massachusetts is so liberal, and people are furious that Dave Ratner is there defending Trump's signing of a bill that is going to be terrible for people. And Dave Ratner now has issued some major apologies saying, I'm not there because I support Trump. I've always wanted employers to be able to buy insurance across state lines or something. I'm not a bad guy. And his business now is actually significantly in danger, I would say, not of going out of business, but of being damaged in terms of profitability. Anyway, that's Dave Ratner. Back to the Obamacare stuff. The idea here is what? The Affordable Care Act will stay, but premiums are going to increase because now that the insurers are no longer going to get government subsidies, they are going to have to make up for that lost revenue by charging people more for insurance. It's very, very straightforward. Insurers are realizing that this is not going to be good for them because when they do have to raise premiums, they're going to lose some customers, right? And they were expecting $9 billion in the coming year. They had nearly $100 billion coming to them in the coming decade that they are now not going to get. This is spiteful, disgusting, vile, and it's an attempt to score political points by hurting people. And lots of those people are Trump voters. President Obama warned us about this. Others during the end of the Obama administration warned us, without repealing Obamacare, you could defund aspects of it. And I've been talking about it for months. But here's the kicker. Trump does this, and it crashes health insurance stock prices. Now, I'm not taking a position on whether that's good or bad. I've said before, if we had single-payer healthcare, it would probably also be bad for health insurance companies and their share value. But this announcement was bad for health insurance stocks. And Trump goes on Twitter and brags about it. Trump took to Twitter over the weekend and said health insurance stocks, which have gone through the roof during the Obamacare years, plunged yesterday after I ended their Democrats' windfall. Number one, days ago, Donald Trump was taking credit for the massive stock market rally that we've seen during the first 7-8 months of the Trump administration. Now Trump is cheering that his actions have crashed the stock prices of health insurance companies. From one day to the next, Trump has gone from stocks are doing great and it's because of me to stocks have plunged and it's because of me. And somehow both are good. Well, which is it? Both can't possibly be true. But my bigger question to Donnie Boy is, if you're okay with crashing health insurance stocks, if you're doing something you feel is good for people with health care, why not just do single payer? That's what would be the best for people. And it would also be bad for health insurance stocks. And you could brag about it the way you're doing now on Twitter. I don't understand the logic behind this, and it's probably because there is no logic. What I want to touch on is how this will impact you. There's basically two parts here. This is part of the cost sharing reduction program. Part one is that insurance companies have to give people on silver plans whose incomes are under 250% of the poverty line lower deductibles and co-payments. That doesn't change with what Donald Trump has signed. Part two is that there are budget items that give insurers money to reimburse people, or rather give insurers money to reimburse them for having lower deductibles to low-income people. That's the part that Trump is crushing. Part two, part one is not going to be touched. How much money could you make shorting stocks if you knew ahead of time what stunts Donald Trump had planned? And shorting stocks is basically, it's a way to, you're basically borrowing stocks with the idea that the price is going to decrease and you can make money off of the decrease of the value of a stock. Imagine if Vlad Vladimir Putin, who, according to some, including Fareed Zakaria, is by far the richest person on the planet, even though he does a good job of hiding his wealth. Imagine if Vlad knew what stunts Trump was planning. A lot of money that could be made about on that. Maybe we'll learn about that someday. The right likes to say that they have a claim on patriotism. They have the monopoly on respect for the military. They support the troops, often by supporting whatever mission the president wants to send them on, if it's a Republican, or by putting a yellow ribbon on their car. The right decides what is disrespectful, and they've decided it's disrespectful to peacefully protest at a football game by kneeling during the national anthem. And Donald Trump has been all over this. It's disrespectful to the flag to kneel at a football game. It's disrespectful to the military. Donald Trump has now disrespected the flag by his own standards. Trump was at a Pennsylvania Air National Guard base being interviewed by Fox News' Sean Hannity. And during the interview, Retreat started playing, which happens when there is an American flag lowering ceremony. This is a time when you're supposed to, according to U.S. flag code, stand and cover your heart and look towards the flag. And what did Trump do? He sat there talking to Sean Hannity, notices the song is playing and jokes maybe it's being played for him, or if it's being played for Sean Hannity's great ratings on Fox News. If you're watching this clip, you'll notice that as soon as the song starts, people in the background all stand and start saluting the flag, but not Trump. Very disrespectful, isn't it? Take a look.
GDP. Now, I have to tell you, for the last quarter, you had 3%.
3-2.
And actually 3-2, they adjusted it upward. What a nice sound that is. Are they playing that for you or for me? They're playing that in honor of his ratings. Did you see how good his ratings? He's beating everybody.
I think they'll be higher tonight. I'm just guessing.
So the fact is that we're really rocking. We have 3.2 now. This next.
Kneeling is disrespecting the flag. It's disrespecting our military. And Trump sits during the flag lowering ceremony as everybody else stands. And it goes further. If you believe in the concept of flag respect, when Retreat is played for a flag lowering ceremony, you're actually supposed to stand. To understand the level of hypocrisy, I'm actually going to show you the flag code called Conduct During Hoisting, Lowering, or Passing a Flag, which says very clearly, during the ceremony of hoisting or lowering the flag, or when the flag is passing in a parade or in review, all persons present in uniform should render the military salute. Members of the armed forces and veterans who are present but not in uniform may render the military salute. All other persons present should face the flag and stand at attention with their right hand over their heart. That is very, very clear. And Donald Trump says that sons of bitches should be fired from the NFL because they kneel, even though there's no actual code for what NFL players are supposed to do during the national anthem. And then Trump himself ignores the actual flag code. I could not actually care less about this nonsense, but it is by these people's own standards that they do everything they accuse others of doing wrong. Hillary's emails, they're all using private email. Drain the swamp. Trump is filling the swamp so much that it's overflowing. Kneeling during the national anthem is disrespectful to the flag. They sit during an actual moment when the flag code tells us what to do. And of course, the bigger issue is that the NFL players did it in protest. Trump is just ignorant. There was no message behind what he said. Are they playing Retreat for me or for your ratings, Sean? There was no message there other than I'm a moron. Being silent and not moving in the world of Trump is more disrespectful than joking about the music being played during a flag lowering ceremony. But remember that time when Obama saluted a service member while holding a cup of coffee in his hand? That's really what's disrespectful. They've decided. Let's take a break. DavidPakman.com/Reddit. Discuss any or all of these topics with us. We'll be back after this.
The David Pakman Show at DavidPakman.com. Welcome back to the David Pakman Show.
I'm pleased to welcome back to the program David McAfee, who's a religious studies graduate, a 6-time published author, founder of the Party of Reason and Progress. And the new book is called No Sacred Cows, which deals with really a lot of subject matter that we talk about on the program. So first, David, you have been studying and researching everything from sects to cults to the belief in the paranormal and religious beliefs for a very long time. So what made you want to look more specifically at what you talk about in this particular book?
I started studying religion specifically when I was 18. I started majoring in religious studies at UCSB, but it was a few years later that I started realizing that there was this gap in information about other supernatural beliefs and people who separated them so much. I just saw the innate similarities between, say, Christianity and its supernatural practices like prayer, and then other non-religious supernatural aspects. And I just was so curious to find more connections between those two. And so that's what I set out to do.
Yeah, and there's a number of studies which point out, I believe accurately, that there is a decrease in sort of devout religious belief and also just more casual association with organized religion. But at the same time, you talk in the book about how we're not seeing an equivalent, I guess we would say, decrease in belief in supernatural claims that are outside of religious beliefs. So first, how do we measure that? And then we can maybe get into some of the more common beliefs.
Yeah, and that's exactly accurate. Every study that I've seen, every reputable study that I've seen has shown a rise in people who don't identify with any particular religious tradition. They call it the rise of the nones, the unaffiliated people. And so a lot of people assume that that means that we are seeing a lot more critical thinking and people are thinking through these things and deciding not to adhere to these traditions. But when you look at other polls about belief in ghosts and psychics and other supernatural beliefs that you would think would be on the same tier, they tend to be rising at a pretty rapid rate. And so that's why I wrote this book, was because I thought that that needed the attention, because people seem to be under the impression that they're always correlated, and it's really not true.
What would be a top line general explanation? Because on the one hand, we like to think that the reason for the decline in religiosity is as science develops and as sort of knowledge of empiricism spreads through the world, it maybe eliminates the need or place for organized or devout religious beliefs. But if that were the sole reason or primary reason, you'd imagine you'd have fewer people believing in psychics and ancient aliens as well.
Exactly. I think the problem is that people aren't necessarily thinking more critically about all their beliefs. They might be pushing a religion away for any number of reasons. For one, it's more ancient than a lot of these beliefs. It ties into a specific dogma. So with ghosts and other supernatural beliefs, there's not really this book that bounds you to believe in it. And it might be a push away from that, away from the rigidity of religion and toward the fluidity of New Age beliefs.
And what are the most common? I mean, you talked about psychics and you alluded to some others, but when we're talking about supernatural beliefs, what's included there and what are the most common?
I would say angels and demons tend to be the most common. When I looked at polls, it seemed like even more people believed in angels in the United States than identified with Christianity, from which you would think that they would be getting the angel concept. But there's an entire separate belief system there from people who believe in angels but don't believe in any religion. They believe in guardian angels or just some vague concept that they grew up with. But it's true with all of these different supernatural beliefs. We can name thousands of them, and I do in the book. But I think the problem is that people are just wanting to believe in something bigger, and they're moving away from religion. They need something else to move toward. That's not always something supernatural, but in many cases it is. In other cases, it's conspiracy theories, which also factor in that same idea that there's something greater controlling everything.
Well, that was what I was next going to sort of mention, which is the overlap in the sort of processes that take place in someone's mind that get them to the conclusion of some supernatural belief or concluding that a conspiracy theory is actually the explanation for some phenomena in our world rather than whatever the so-called official story is. Do you believe that it is the same sort of process that gets people to those end conclusions?
I pretty much argue that in the book that the same failures of critical thinking lead to all of these different false beliefs, whether it's religion or even these cults or conspiracy theories or other supernatural beliefs. It's because somebody didn't take the time to think, okay, let's look at what has been scientifically proven, and then we compare that to what I want to believe. You got to separate your desires. You have to separate what your friends and family have told you to believe. These are all influences that aren't necessarily going to get you to the right place, but people trust their family, they trust their friends, and so if they say that they saw a ghost, then you had a feeling once that you might have seen a ghost. That belief becomes solidified, and there's not really much that can change it. It's similar to religion in that instance.
Talk a little bit about, both for this book, but also in your past, you've done some of this, some of what I guess I'd call them undercover incidents or undercover attempts to learn more about some of these phenomena.
Definitely. This book was kind of my biggest step in that direction, because it contains, I think, at least 10 different interviews with believers, with psychics, with members of the Westboro Baptist Church, with the great-grandson of L. Ron Hubbard. And not all of these interviews, not in all of them do I identify myself as a skeptic. I just am basically asking questions to these people. And in this book, I decided to take it one step further, and I actually trained myself to become a psychic, to become a seer, a cold reader. And I started performing on Venice Beach, and I went undercover in that way. And it really, really opened my eyes to how these beliefs are formed and solidified, because there were people who were so convinced by my presentation, which was completely not magic, of course, that they wouldn't believe me when I revealed at the end that I was a skeptic and that this was a thought experiment. They refused to believe me. They said that I was just trying to cover myself so that the government wouldn't come get me. I had people trying to give me so much money, and I was like, no, these are completely free readings. I didn't take a dollar, but this one woman in particular just wanted to give me money, and I was like, this must be such an easy job for the people who really do it and want to take money.
So, I mean, I think that how long it takes one to learn the skill of cold reading, which is sort of the underlying skill in what is colloquially described as being a psychic. I think that depending on one's emotional intelligence, so to speak, it could take you more or less time to learn those skills and to play off of the reactions of the person you're reading. But can you tell us a little bit about how long your training was and what it consisted of?
Yes. So I've always really been good at reading people, at reading their expressions on their face and guessing what they're thinking based on that. And I never really took it the next step, obviously, to pretend to be psychic. So this was really, really easy for me. I would say I read books for about 2 months before I actually did my first live show. And I would just practice, even online. I would go on online chats, and even just seeing somebody's picture and talking to them online, I was able to guess things like their name by just putting a letter on the keyboard, and then they'll say, oh, that letter's in my name, and then I can kind of figure it out from there. And I've also used warm reading, hot reading, where you can research the person who's in front of you before they get there or while they're there. There are a lot of different tricks that I used. I would say about 2-3 months of total preparation, and I didn't have any dissatisfied customers.
What are some of the key books in your research that you read?
Psychic Sciences is a really good one. That's from the point of view of believers, of course. But then I also read a lot of books by James Randi. He has really done so much work on that topic that there isn't anybody who's done more than him. So I read all of his books on the topic.
Yeah.
And it helped me out so much, because I was able to see how he exposed other psychics. And so I was able to learn from those mistakes. And when people tried to expose me, which did happen quite a few times, I was able to anticipate that and then make it even more impressive for them, really.
So you said earlier that, similarly to religious beliefs, that it is difficult to get people to critically re-examine how they came to these sort of supernatural beliefs. Can you give us some of the better ways to try to get people to re-examine those beliefs? And I'm sort of brought to the basic sort of epistemology, Socratic
Yep.
method of questioning that we've heard from people like Peter Boghossian and others, right? Exploring how someone came to a conclusion and what it might take to change their mind are sort of some of the few inroads that we might be able to make.
That's exactly right. I talk a lot in the book about the Socratic method and how questions help people understand these concepts more than statements. So if I were to tell you this is how a psychic works, people are less likely to believe me than if I said, well, how do you think they came to this conclusion? Why would this psychic say, I'm feeling a letter and then name the letter? Why would a ghost or a spirit speak to them in letters and fragments instead of, if they're really there, actually speaking to them? And why is everything so vague? And so when I ask those types of questions, it's not like anybody is like, oh, psychics are fake and all this stuff is fake and walked away, but it does plant that seed of doubt, and that's really what it's all about. I also talk about how to do all that while being extremely nice. It never helps, or it rarely helps, to be confrontational. And so I'm very polite in all my discussions, and I really try to focus on the actual issues, try to criticize with kindness, as Daniel Dennett has said, and it seems to work very well that way.
The book is fascinating. We've been speaking with the author of the new book, No Sacred Cows, David McAfee. He's a religious studies graduate, 6-time published author, and also the founder of the Party of Reason and Progress. David, great job with the book, and thanks so much for talking to us about it.
Thank you very much for having me again. I appreciate it.
The David Pakman Show at davidpakman.com. The David Pakman Show at davidpakman.com.
We've been sort of theorizing about how dumb Donald Trump is. And by dumb, I mean just sort of general knowledge. We figured out that after a year of campaigning on health insurance, he might have the entire time actually been thinking that it was life insurance. We speculated he might not have been aware that Puerto Ricans were citizens until someone told him, hey, you know, these are American citizens, during the fallout after the multiple hurricanes that hit the Puerto Rican island. Trump's lack of knowledge about what a blind trust is was evident in the lead up to his inauguration. How does the stock market work? How does money work? Is a strong or weak dollar good for us? Something he called Michael Flynn about at 3 a.m. at one point. Why didn't hurricane victims just get away from the storm in their private helicopters? Whatever, right? There's a range of different questions we've speculated as to Donald Trump's knowledge on. Donald Trump claimed over the weekend, while speaking to a hate group, that he met with the president of the Virgin Islands. Of course, there is no such person, or I guess there is. It's Donald Trump himself. The president of the United States is the president of the Virgin Islands, effectively. Here is Donald Trump at this horrible hate group rally. Take a look.
We also stand with the millions of people who have suffered from the massive fires which are right now raging in California, and the catastrophic hurricanes along the Gulf Coast in Puerto Rico, the Virgin Islands. And I will tell you, I left Texas, and I left Florida, and I left Louisiana, and I went to Puerto Rico, and I met with the president of the Virgin Islands. These are people that are incredible people. They've suffered gravely.
Some of those people are literally incredible in the sense that they don't exist and we shouldn't believe in them, like this other guy or gal who supposedly is the president of the United States Virgin Islands. Now, how did the Trump administration deal with this bogus and embarrassing statement by Trump? Well, they corrected the transcript so that it would say governor instead of president after the fact. The White House released a transcript where it says, I left Florida and I left Louisiana and I went to Puerto Rico and I met with the president is crossed out. Governor has been inserted of the Virgin Islands. Every single joke about Donald Trump becomes the truth. 2 weeks ago, I joked, Donald Trump should demand the resignation of the president of Puerto Rico over his terrible handling of the recent hurricanes. And now Trump actually says, I met with the president of the U.S. Virgin Islands in the context of hurricane relief. I spoke with myself about disaster relief because I'm doing great things for these poor people or something like that. Here's Donald explaining why he's the guy to go to with any issue we have because he's such a smart guy.
And I was a good student. I understand things. I comprehend very well, okay? Better than, I think, almost anybody. And I want to tell you, I listened to a bunch of stuff last night on television that was disgraceful. It was disgraceful.
He listened to a whole bunch of stuff. Something is very wrong here beyond just being an uninformed dude born with a silver spoon in his mouth, right? Remember when it would have been surprising if the president said something this dumb? The simpler times of, is our children learning, and binders full of women, or what's Aleppo? What is that? What's Aleppo? Those were simpler, quaint times, where now we are dealing with a whole new level of incompetence and stupidity from the president of the United States. There is a major, major anti-vaxxer panic over a total misunderstanding of a vaccination situation. I'm going to tell you the story of Rebecca Bredow, who's a Michigan mom. Previously, Rebecca was sent to jail for refusing to comply with a court order that mandated her 9-year-old son be vaccinated. Now, you might hear that and say, a government, a court is mandating vaccination for kids? Well, not exactly. Rebecca used to have primary custody of her son. She was released last week. She was expecting to be reunited with her son, but not so fast. She has now lost primary custody, which will be split 50-50 with the son's father. During this period, the son also received 4 immunizations and is now completely up to date with vaccination. The mother, Rebecca Bredow, did not want her son vaccinated. The father did want her son vaccinated. Anti-vaxxers are going nuts, saying the government cannot mandate vaccination. The government has not mandated vaccination. Rebecca agreed as part of a court custody hearing to have the child vaccinated in deference to the wishes of the father. She agreed to that as part of a custody hearing. She has not done that and thus was held in contempt of court. The fact that it is vaccinations is secondary. The issue is she agreed to this in front of a court as part of a custody hearing. And she has now said, after agreeing to the vaccinations, that she doesn't want them because of her religious beliefs. She's never detailed her religious beliefs that I was able to find, and who knows if that's just something she's saying to try to prevent the vaccinations. But she has not been jailed for not vaccinating her kid specifically. The kid is not being given partial custody to the father because she has not vaccinated specifically. It's because she violated the custody agreement that she agreed to in front of a court. And she has fallen into contempt of court by ignoring that. And the anti-vaxxers are going absolutely and totally crazy about this. Now, to go back for a second to the religious exemptions thing, most states actually still have religious exemptions for vaccination, but it is not for any purpose. It is specifically if you want your kids in public schools. The anti-vaxxers like to say government mandates that kids get vaccines. Well, no. It's that government-run schools, public schools, require vaccination. And if you want your kid to go to those schools, which is by no means a necessity, then the kids need to be vaccinated. Only California, Mississippi, and West Virginia have removed exemptions from school vaccination for religious purposes. If you want your kids in those schools, then yes, you are going to need to comply and vaccinate them, but you are not obligated to do that. I actually just witnessed, recently I was at a little kind of fall gathering with some friends, and there were 2 people I know that work in the medical field doing research that's not directly related to vaccination, but it's kind of close. And an anti-vaxxer mom was there with full indignation telling them they need to look into the science more because she knows the truth and they don't. And it's an appeal to authority fallacy to say the people working in the medical field are right merely because they work in the medical field. But the idea that any random stay-at-home mom who's homeschooling her kids to avoid vaccinations knows more than people actually working in the medical field, that I take issue with. 219-2-DAVID-P is our voicemail number. Here's a voicemail accusing me of not knowing that the word to legitimate is false. Take a listen to this.
Hi, this is David Hunter from Lake Harmony, Pennsylvania. I just wanted to let David know that there is no word legitimates. The word is legitimize or legitimizes. Anyway, put my 2 cents in.
Yeah. Well, those are your 2 cents. Here's my 2 cents. And that is that I'm putting up on the screen for you the dictionary definition of to legitimate as a verb. The adjective legitimate means that it conforms to the law or to rules. But of course, there is a definition of the word spelled the same way, but it is pronounced legitimate, which is a verb, and it is to make legitimate, to justify or make lawful. For example, the regime was not legitimated by popular support. So, David, I appreciate your 2 cents, and I am returning those 2 cents, or at least a different 2 cents of mine to you, and telling you that the word to legitimate, as I used it, is correct. And because of that, I have no time to tell you what's on the bonus show, but trust me, folks, it's a good one.
The David Pakman Show at davidpakman.com.